Woodwork Geek back here again. This week, a watch box. And what a box it turned out to be. This wood I think is rosewood, although correct me if I'm wrong. And then I've put maple accents onto the box with silver clasp and hinges on it. It was a bit of a labour of love, I have to say, and I've kind of sped up the footage of making this really to the max. So if you want me to do a longer version of this, I'm more than happy to do. Just let me know in the comments and I'll break it into a two-parter. I start off with the wood and trying to find the best grain in the wood. So you can see just there I was mapping out where the best cuts would be. Once I know what grain pattern I'm trying to get on the box edges, I then plane and then bandsaw and cut the piece of wood in half. By cutting the piece of wood in half, the two inside faces, when you cut it in half, they become the outsides of the box. And here you can see I'm just trimming up those pieces to cut them into four using the bandsaw, because it's such a narrow blade, you lose less trim, less wastage, and so the grain pattern follows a lot better. I use my sliding saw to put a 45-degree profile on each of the edges, and when I do that I'm putting one piece on top of the other to make sure that all of the pieces are exactly the same dimension. I then glue the box up and use a kind of picture frame clamp to then kind of keep it all nice and tight. Before I glue it, I sand all of the inside faces, and then I put masking tape across each of the joints to make sure that on the inside of the box I don't get any nasty glue lines that will kind of be a pain to clean up afterwards. On the box I then put the tape across each of the joints to kind of hold the box in place whilst I put the glue in and kind of get the clamp around the outside. And this for me makes for nice tight kind of joints across the whole box. You can see I just use a square just to make sure everything's perfectly as it should be, and test the diagonals. Once I've done that, I take another piece of the rosewood, I cut it in half again, glue it together, and that will become the base of the watch box so that all the wood kind of matches. Here you can see as I spin the box, the grain pattern just flowing all the way through the outside of the box, and I really kind of think that really is a spectacular kind of outer edge for any box. So it's about this point I didn't realise I was making a watch box. I was toying with the idea of a jewellery box, but at that point I kind of realised that watch box was the best kind of use for this kind of piece of wood. I then kind of moved on to try and cut the maple down. So here you can see me trimming down some maple and just making it to stock. I then take the base and I cut the base and trim the base to fit in the box itself, just gently taking little bit by little bit until I get a perfect fit on the saw. Now here I've got a kind of conundrum. How am I going to make that piece of maple work in terms of the box? And what I was trying to work out in my head is the right profile of cuts on that piece of wood to get a piece of maple that will fit the inside of the top of the box but give me enough cutaway to put a piece of glass on the inside so it would show the contents off. And here you can see I'm just taking the first cut of wood away, and what I end up making is a T shape, and that T shape then has a recess on the inside of the box to take the glass, and then it has another recess on the outside to then fit over the outside of the box. once I've got that piece of wood all trimmed up, I then kind of cut the miters on those pieces of wood to get them to fit round the outside nice and tightly. And you can see me there just kind of test fitting them and getting them so that they work, and then gluing them in. After I've done that, I then take another piece of maple and cut that piece of maple into strips to then make dividers for the inside. Well, for the inside of Mark 1 of the box. Once the maple lid insert's dried, I then cut the lid off, as you can see, and then I sand flat the base and the lid to get a nice clean joint. And cutting the lid off on the bandsaw like that enables me to get the grain pattern to follow across the whole side of the box from the lid through to the side of the box. So it kind of just makes it look that little bit more kind of special. Here you can see me making the inserts for the kind of dividers for the watch, and at this point I didn't have any of the cushions or pillows for the watches, so I just divided the inside of the box up into 6 sections that I figured would be the right kind of size to hold 6 watches. This bit me in the end. The adage, measure twice, cut once, kind of comes back to play when the kind of pillows did come, and they were tiny in comparison to the holes that they needed to fill in, and I had to remake a whole load of stuff. The part I'm doing now is cutting in the hinge rebates, and I use a mixture of the kind of router and chisels to do this. And I use the router mainly because then I can get the offset for the hinge on the top and on the base exactly the same. So I used I think it was a 1/4 inch bit in the router, and that took off the vast majority of the gap for the hinge. The hinges, in hindsight, I cut incorrectly. I actually cut half the depth on the base and half the depth on the lid. If I did this again, what I'd actually do is recess the hinge into one face, and then it would screw into the other face, and that would then mean that I wouldn't have needed to take a relief cut off the back of the box to enable the lid to open. It sounds a bit complicated, but by putting half and half on the hinge, when it opened, it was hitting. With all things kind of hinge related, you need to be very, very accurate when you cut them. And here you can see me just using a bit of wax on the screws as I screw them into the wood, just to try and prevent the screws from breaking as I kind of put them in. It came out well. I was really happy. There was the alignment of the lid and the box was perfect. So for my kind of first set of hinges, I was very, very pleased with how I made them kind of work. After doing the hinges, I then moved on to doing the clasp. So that needed a part put onto the lid and a part put onto the base. And I had to make sure that when I put that part on, that it held the top quite tight. So the top part of the hinge, I kind of pulled up slightly so that when it closes, it actually pulls the top down. And it worked out perfectly. I was really happy with how that kind of came off in the end. For the, again, first attempt at doing these kind of clasps and hinges, I really couldn't be happier with the way that it come out. Once all of the hinge pieces and all the brackets and stuff were on, it was then a sanding. So this box got sanded to quite a high kind of grit. So we're talking 400 grit, for all the way from kind of 80 grit up to 400. Same way I do all the chopping boards, just to make sure that everything is as perfect as I can make it. The parts I couldn't get with the sander, I did with sandpaper. So you can see me here just doing final sands, and the sandpaper unfortunately only goes up to 120, so I limited that to some of the inside faces and parts where you can't get to the sander. After this part, it was time for getting the kind of branding iron out and marking up the middle of the box to leave my kind of proud marker's make on it. I was just doing the last kind of few bits of sanding whilst that was heating up, and then I put the burn on the bottom of the box with the kind of logo on it, making sure to kind of wet it before and after. Then you're on to oiling. So I used 2 oils on this. I used the extra thin Osmos oil, and then I used Osmos top oil, which is common for pretty much all of my projects. And I just love the deep brown that this wood came out in, with the contrasting kind of light maple. It was really, really kind of pretty to look at. Here I am just doing the insides, and at this point still little did I know that when the kind of pillows come it was going to be disaster. But I got a coat of paint on it and got it all finished, and it come out nice at this point. I was very pleased by it. I don't think I had the glass at this point, so one of the next jobs was to get to the glazers to pick up a piece of kind of glass to fit the opening, and there I have the kind of inserts that I then made to hold the glass in place. So there's the glass in situ. I have to say, glass isn't cheap these days. I put the glass in. I used kind of 4 sides with countersunk holes to screw it in, so if there's ever a problem with the glass we can just undo those screws, replace the glass, and then reattach the holding kind of pieces of wood that pinch the glass in place. And it came out really well. Really pleased with it. I made sure that it would be done with Osmos, the same as everything else. And I did struggle somewhat with the kind of angles there, because the drill and the screwdrivers wouldn't fit kind of parallel to the top in the way that I wanted them to. But I got it to work in the end, and it ended up looking lovely. I think if I did it again, I'd probably be tempted to use pins rather than screws, just because it would have been a little bit easier to get them in. The kind of very small screws were a bit of a pain, it has to be said. It wasn't long after this that the pillows come, and then I realised my sizing was somewhat off. As you can see shortly, when I put the pillows into the case, they flop around something crazy, which, given that this is supposed to be for some pretty premium high class watches, not the kind of state of affairs that you want to be seeing. You see there the gap all the way round. So that was the end of Mark 1. So it was then on to start thinking about how I would build Mark 2. So Mark 2 was made very differently from Mark 1. What I needed to do was to make the wooden dividers much wider. So I plumbed for another bit of rosewood. I made them a lot narrower, or less height, so that the watches sit down further in the box, and the depth being about 20 mil rather than kind of 5 mil. That was enough to tidy up the gap. So after cutting it on the bandsaw and then running it through the drum sander, I then rough fit the pieces in, cutting them so that I get that same kind of H pattern in the box. And then when I saw the kind of pattern in the box, I realised that it was too plain, so I had the great idea of putting a maple stripe down the centre of the rosewood just to give it some contrast. So I basically run the rosewood through the table saw both sides so that I get an even gap down the dead centre of the piece of wood. I then machined a piece of maple to that exact dimension using the drum sander to get down to a nice snug fit, and then cut the crosshairs out so that I would get a kind of perfect joint all the way across. After that, it's a case of gluing it up. So here you can see me putting the two long lengths in and then trimming the shorter lengths down so that I get that kind of stripe across the whole pattern. And then I just use one clamp to clamp the three smaller pieces to the two long pieces to get a good glue joint, and kind of that's the end of that really. After I've got the piece all made and it's dried, I then give it a quick sand. I then oil it, and then it's a case of doing the leather inserts to the base of the box so that when the bracelet part of the watch is on the bottom, it's got a piece of leather to rest on and not the box where it could damage the kind of bracelet. This box is for kind of Rolexes and Omegas. It's for premium kind of product, so we don't want any kind of damage to any of those watches. So a piece of leather on the bottom was perfect for protecting the watches. And that was it. The watch box was done. I thoroughly enjoyed making this. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you've made it this far, like and subscribe. If you want a longer, kind of slower version where you can actually see some of the machining and the work's being done on this box, then let me know and I'll get it produced. Woodwork Geek, over and out.